Ladies and gentlemen, welcome on the virtual premises of the Institute for History of Medicine and Foreign Languages, which is part of the First Faculty of Medicine at the Charles University in Prague. My name is Tomáš Alušík and I'm Associate Professor of the Institute. As some of you may know, from time to time we organize lectures where speakers talk about a broad range of topics, more or less connected with the underlying theme of history and archaeology of medicine. This year is no exception, and some of these activities take place in the hybrid mode. Speaking of which, I would like to ask everyone attending via Zoom to keep your microphone muted and your cameras turned off. I would also like to inform you that this lecture is recorded and will be uploaded to the First Faculty of Medicine official YouTube channel within a few days. I don't want to waste your time, so let me first thank everyone in the audience for coming here. It's nice to meet you. And I would also like to thank the speaker, Professor James Palmer from the University of St. Andrews. James studied at the universities of Cambridge and Sheffield, where he earned his doctorate. He held posts at the universities of Leicester and Nottingham before moving to St. Andrews. He became a full professor there in 2019. James's research focuses on culture and religion from circa 400 to 900. He is particularly interested in the movement of ideas and people across different cultural worlds and the consequences of the exchanges involved, especially in the areas that became France and Germany. His earliest work focused on saints, hagiography, and apocalyptic beliefs. He is presently working on a project on early medieval science, medicine, and belief, particularly with the corpus of early medieval Latin medicine in collaboration with Claire Burridge, Jeff Doolittle, McLeod, and Karin van Rijn. His latest book was published last year with the title Merovingian Worlds, and his new book, entitled Charlemagne's Dream, The Rise and Fall of the Carolingian Empire, will come out in August 2026. His today's presentation reports on the corpus of early medieval Latin medicine project, thanks to which the number of cataloged medical manuscripts have been more than doubled, allowing for new insights into what was known, how it was conceptualized, and how it was used. James, it's a great pleasure for us, and the microphone is yours, please.
Thank you very much. So today, my topic is really to introduce some of the work we've been doing with our British Academy funded project, the Corpus of Early Medieval Latin Medicine, and thinking some of the conceptual issues that it has thrown up for us as a team of researchers. And I hope you'll find this as exciting as it has been for us. I would say now that right from the off, a lot of what I'm going to say is not necessarily things that I'm taking credit for. This project is very much a team effort, as I will be emphasizing on many occasions. I am just the person giving voice to their ideas today, and on other occasions it could have been any one of our team who would have stepped up and said these things. So. This is the structure of my talk today. I'm going to talk about the grand narrative as it has broadly stood until recent years, about how early medieval Latin medicine is bad medicine in more than one sense. I'm going to talk about some of the work that our project has been doing to address what I think is a particularly important evidential question surrounding that. I'm going to talk through a couple of aspects about how looking at the results of our project has taken us to consider how medicine might be defined more broadly or differently in different ways, not necessarily novelly, but it's important to be able to understand what medicine might mean to people in different contexts. As part of that, we've also been drawn into thinking about how medicine worked as a body of knowledge in non-medical contexts, which is quite interesting for us as part of a wider general knowledge of what people were learning in the Middle Ages. And then I just want to conclude with some thoughts about where our project might go and what kind of collaborations and things we are already undertaking and thinking about the future and how this subject area might develop. So in that sense, what I'm not going to do is trying to throw quite a lot of very hard technical stuff at you as an audience. It's kind of more of an introductory feel. I'm working on the assumption that some luminaries in the audience aside, that you don't know very much about early medieval medicine, and so there's an introductory quality to some of the work that I'm going to discuss today. So I'm going to start off with thinking about this idea that a lot of early medieval medicine is bad medicine. And I think that, and I said at the beginning that this kind of comes out of two particular sides of things, and not necessarily exclusively the work of the two people I've put on screen, Karl Züdhoff and Valentin Rosa, but for me, that these are two people who are quite emblematic of some of the problems. Karl Züdhoff, coming very much from a medical background to stimulate the idea of history of medicine in Germany, the late 19th century going into the early 20th century. And Valentin Rosa very much coming from a more philological background, working in the Prussian library in Berlin. And what they both kind of saw was that a lot of medicine that was produced after the fall of the Roman Empire, so really thinking 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, was not very interesting to them. For Züdhoff, as somebody who was coming from someone with a proper trained medical background, he could just look at the material that was in circulation and see that it wasn't very theoretical, it wasn't very progressive. There didn't seem to be a lot of scientific method. There didn't seem to be a lot of interest in trying to progress the field. It seemed practical, and the theorization seemed quite minimal. For Rosa, on the other hand, what he could see was that the quality of the writing was just very bad. It was often ungrammatical as far as he was concerned, as someone whose early work was transcribing and editing classical texts. He found that the language used was loose at best. And to give you one example, this is a page of his edition of some of a text by a North African scholar, Vindicianus. You don't need to be able to read it. The important thing is that when confronted with 5 different versions of the same text, he could not construct what he felt to be the archetypal original. He had to print it in 5 different columns. And to which Züdhoff then added an extra 2 versions, and then subsequently, the more versions have come in, cannot be synthesized together. And so it's kind of interesting that what we kind of get is just a multiplicity of forms. And there's something about, I think, the way we approach this material in the 21st century might feel a lot more comfortable about that. For Rosa and Züdhoff, this was barbaric Latin. This was poor intellectual practice. And in many respects, they're right. And there's a lot about the grand narrative that doesn't so much need to change, but needs to be looked at differently. So in particular, in the case of the Latin not being very good, well, this is a more vernacular Latin. This is the kind of Latin that people were maybe speaking in North Africa in the 5th century, but then it transmits to Italy and to France. And so the different kind of dialects and Latin that they'd be speaking there as well. That there's lots of little forms that suggest this is coming out of spoken Latin rather than just scribes' inability to copy words correctly. So that's a very important dynamic that comes into play there. There's also just thinking about how a lot of this comes out of evidence from monastic environments, and Rosa and Züdhoff were quite critical of what we are seeing here is medicine is moving away from medical professionalism that we might have seen in the ancient world to some degree to be the product of monkish medicine. It's not that the monks were uninterested in it, but it wasn't. The body is kind of a secondary thing. God will sort of take care of that. And so maybe it just needs the kind of practical stuff that can maybe soothe the body a little bit. And so the kind of the fact that most of our surviving evidence comes from monastic environments is itself a cause for some if not outright criticism, then disappointment to generations of historians of medicine. Now, this is kind of the old view where lots of the texts have then fallen into disrepair through religion and language and a lack of interest. But there's still quite a lot of it, and a lot of building up to where our project comes in. There have been two very important catalogues that came out, I would say, the latter part of that phase of thinking about early medieval medicine as bad. One on the left by Augusto Beccaria, which is translated as the manuscripts of medicine of the pre-Salerno period. The Salerno period, really starting in the late 11th century, is when there's a dedicated school where there's lots of production of texts and kind of rebirth and reinvigoration of kind of classical studies of medicine, drawing on Greek and Greek and Arabic learning, but in translation in the Latin world. So this is only about the Latin quality of medicine. We're not making comments on the Greek here. But so that for him, for Beccaria, was just 9th, 10th, and 11th century manuscripts. And then in 1965, and Wickersheimer produced a catalogue of Latin manuscripts from French libraries only. Doing a similar kind of thing. So for both of them, they were finding big medical books. I'll give you an example. Here is a big medical book. This is what they look like. This is what one looks like in the wild, although this isn't actually one that either of them catalogued. This is in Glasgow University Library, but I got a nice photo of it from when I went to visit it, so this is why it is here now. But you can see that this is a big, substantial book. There's a lot of knowledge packed into there. Actually, some of it is quite theoretical, and some of it is interesting. There are sections on women's medicine. There's just general medicine. Lots of recipes. There's discussion of the humors and the seasons. But the thing is, Beccaria and Wickersheimer, between them, had catalogued about 225 of these manuscripts, really stretching from the 9th to the 11th century, which is quite a lot. And it kind of gives us a nice solid base that we could keep going to analyze. Now, on the back of that, it would be nonsense to say that people hadn't been looking at this. I mean, over the last 20, 30 years, there's been great work by Monica Green on the Salerno medicine material, Klaus Dietrich Fischer, and Arsenio Rodrigo had looked at individual manuscripts, circulation in different texts, and what they had really noticed that if you kind of go and zero in on particular manuscripts, you can see that these different versions have their own logic. We can reconstruct new texts, and all sorts of exciting things can start to come into focus. And in particular, we get this idea that there's actually a lot more evidence than even Wickersheimer and Beccaria had really started to fully catalogue. And then there is the classic article, or this kind of middle period kind of really kicks into an exceptional gear with Peregrine Horden's famous article, What's Wrong with Early Medieval Medicine, in which, sorry, some of the words on screen in the room are disappearing behind screens, but so let us concede that early medieval medicine does not work. It is bad medicine, at best a placebo. A lot of the recipes probably don't actually have any good scientific basis for working. But he continues, but then let's approach it as an anthropologist would do. And thinking about, for him, health cultures, trying to think not just about whether or not particular ingredients might have the properties that they think they had, but the kind of practices and rituals surrounding that, the intellectual processes that led people to their conclusions in the first place. And I suppose really this is stepping back and thinking about medicine in a more relativist perspective, not as, I mean, most pre-modern medicine by any standards, by our standards, is bad. And you can play this game for science as well. I mean, we'll say, I've also worked in early medieval science, and people who work on modern science have said, can you not use the word science? It's not really science, is it? Like, it doesn't have the precision. It doesn't have the mathematical certainty. What you're dealing with is philosophy at best and kind of nonsense, really. But they still use the word medicine. They still use the word, well, scientia or philosophia in various different contexts. But also, they don't know what standards of knowledge and medicine and science we have now. And it's a bit harsh to say that their learning is irrelevant because we know more now. It was still a stepping stone on the way here. And so yeah, I think it's kind of useful to kind of step back and without making this medicine is good or bad judgment, because it is bad, we've made that judgment. What more we can say about this material and where it might lead us. So this brings us to my project team. Again, unfortunately for people in the room, Karine van Rijn has disappeared behind our screen. I do apologize for this. So a couple of years ago, well, to be fair, Claire Burridge, Karine van Rijn, Meg Lair, Jeff Doolittle had been plotting this idea that they were going to update Beccaria. And as a kind of late addition, they brought me on board. And we got some rolling funding from the British Academy, just small amounts of money to have regular meetings and to see what kind of work we could do. We're a kind of I like to bill us as a non-hierarchical collective that, although there's me and Karine as more senior scholars, will absolutely listen to Claire. Claire is technically the most junior, but she has stuff to teach us. We have things to teach her. I think on paperwork, I'm notionally the principal investigator, but Meg does lots of the organizing. It kind of moves around. We're very much a team. We have monthly or bi-monthly meetings. We have an annual meeting where we've had 2 years when we went to St. Andrews, 1 year when we went to Oslo, and we sit in a room for a couple of days and thrash out ideas, bits of work, look at manuscripts, look at other writings, think about plans. And it's been a really exciting collaborative experience. And at the root of this was just the insight, very much from the other members of the team, that there was a lot of manuscripts had not been catalogued by Beccaria or Wickersheimer. And Thomas said at the beginning that we've kind of more than doubled the figure. So the 225 that Beccaria and Wickersheimer catalogued included a lot of kind of 11th century manuscripts. Possibly even 12th century manuscripts, depending on how the dating of manuscripts works. We have so far only contented ourselves with manuscripts up to about the year 1000, given that it's sometimes difficult to say whether something produced in 1020 was produced in 1020 or 980. There's a little bit of looseness to how you can date manuscripts. But just trying to go to about the year 1000, we've got 200 manuscripts. So it's not doubling the 225, but if you took off their 11th century manuscripts, then we're kind of well on our way. And these are not full medical books necessarily. Some of them are, on the Glasgow book I just showed you. Some of them are manuscripts where they're liturgical manuals where someone has used a page to fill in some recipes. They are letter collections when someone has put in some pseudo-Hippocratic letters to flesh out some thoughts, or they just thought it was interesting. There are lots of missionaries where people have got some grammatical material and some scientific material and some riddles, and they also copied out some medical things. And so this is very exciting for us with our various different backgrounds coming to this material to start to try to think about not just how much more medicine that we have, but also the different contexts in which people were studying it, what they were doing with it. It's not necessarily always the case that someone who's interested in the history of medicine might wonder why a medical text is sitting next to that particular grammatical text, and having all sorts of fun with those kind of different contexts. I mean, Claire, Jeff, and Meg in the team are very much, these are people who have come through as historians of medicine, who have also kind of wider cultural eye on different kind of environments in which intellectual work is taking place. My background, as Thomas said in the introduction at the beginning, my last book was on the Merovingian kingdoms in all its different forms, and my book before that was on hagiography, the study of saints in the early Middle Ages, and the one before that was on the apocalypse. None of this has anything to do with medicine, but I'm interested in ideas and how they develop and how they move across boundaries. Carine van Rijn, one of her, I think it was her first book was a critical edition of a penitential text. And actually her route into this then was from studying priests' handbooks, kind of books that an average priest would have in the 9th century, and seeing just how much medical material was starting to, they were copying down in them and thinking, what is a priest doing? What is their role? That they have got all this medical knowledge being carried around with them. So we kind of on the one hand, we're doing hard work, and on the other, we're just thinking about the different contexts in which this is all taking place. On the screen now, just an example of some of our early work. Again, you don't have to be able to read the words, they're very tiny, but just to show. So of our 200, well, we've got 198 published entries on what is our hand list of new manuscripts while we develop a larger catalogue. And for each one, we've just tried to give a sense of the size of the manuscript, what other things are in the manuscript, so that if you were looking at it, you might know that it was a manuscript with poems or prayers or things. If there's a digitization, where you could find the digitization, some comments on what the actual medical material was itself. We've got a few index words that you can chase down, so you could look down and find other entries in our hand list that had similar kind of materials. And so and then we give everything a number. So everything now has a hand list number, which is unfortunate. Once we've got 198, of course, then we found 2 new ones. And so we've got to we'll just have to insert them with little notes saying C 199 and 200 out of alphabetical order. We have not necessarily ourselves found these manuscripts, it has to be said. Sometimes we've seen little notes in other people's writings, just gone through catalogues, stumbled across this, that, and the other, or some of them are well known in the manuscripts. The only thing that has to be said, these are things that are not in Beccaria and not in Wickersheimer. So it's in that sense in which they are new. So we are standing on the shoulders of giants. We're trying to position ourselves as people who are assembling information to put it into more useful for researchers, people listening, people in the room now, and they can go through and hopefully find things more easily in future, because it's a lot of extra evidence. And so I think we have 3 very easy gains from this material straight from the outset. Our first one is that we have an increased window onto the complexities of textual exchange. Just the problem that Rosa was having when he had 5 different versions. Well, okay, so that we can see even more, but we can start to see more about the circulation of different texts. Claire Burridge at the moment is also part of this project on minuscule texts run by Ildar Garipzanov in Oslo. And so they've been doing some exciting work, just seeing, like, if you've got these short texts, looking at which kind of texts appear in different contexts, why, and hunting down the surprise travelers as they go along. And so there's by doing this, we can hopefully draw more connections. Yesterday we treated Conan Doyle, who's in the room, the launch of his new book. We haven't really looked at the English material for obvious reasons, but Conan's book is kind of a brilliant example of when you actually sit down and start to look at these transmissions and the ghost evidence. We're very much focusing on the physical manuscript evidence. We had Claire Burridge saying what was really impressing her yesterday about Conan's book is the hard work that he's had to put into imagining what manuscripts we've lost to be able to reconstruct some of the material. And just so I really feel we're just in huge data collection mode, that actually those assessments of bad medicine were aesthetically, maybe it was bad, but in terms, we haven't got half the evidence that we could have had to start making judgments about what early medieval medicine was about and what you can do with it and what you can say about it. So these kind of new networks of exchange that we can start to see is kind of really interesting. The second big thing that we can start to see is that we start to see much more information on ingredients hypothetically in circulation. It's always very hard with these manuscripts to know what people were actually using. As you know, there's lots of references to cinnamon. Cinnamon must have come from India or Sri Lanka. Does that mean there's an exciting trade route? Entirely possibly, but or not. We know what they should have been looking for. But actually, even with that, there's some interesting things that the number of times we have manuscripts where people have collected lots and lots of recipes and you'll see on gout again, on gout for a third time. And one of the defining features of these kind of manuscripts is often that the ingredients for each treatment for the condition are quite different. And there's, in fact, the fourth century version of one of these, the medicine of Pliny, starts off by saying, now, when you're traveling, you want to avoid unscrupulous doctors who will probably try to con you with various things. Here, basically, what then follows is here's a lot of material on different kinds of ingredients you can get that might be effective in different places. So if you're ever unable to find one particular set of ingredients, don't worry, you can find an entirely different set. And it might still be bad medicine, but it tells us exciting things about how people think that ingredients might be available and what kind of things that they are looking for. There's a famous letter from the 8th century between someone in England, someone in Germany, and said, well, we've got all these books, we can hear all these exciting ingredients. Like, can you source any of them? What are they? We don't know what they are. So, some manuscripts have little diagrams or little pictures about how to identify particular kinds of herbs. But when Mediterranean medicine, say, reaches northern parts of England and Ireland, you can't expect to find that the ingredients are readily available or that people even know what you're talking about. And so it's kind of then exciting to see what kind of adaptation, if any adaptation is happening at all, takes place across this corpus of evidence. But at least we can see something. We have more evidence on what kind of things people at least think in theory as effective ingredients for recipes and where they might be turning up. The big one that we keep coming back to, and I'll talk a little bit more about in the last 20 minutes or so of this talk, about the questions raised about the definitions of what we might call medicine or science, or indeed in this context, what is Christian and what is pagan? Because it's very easy for us to look at all of these kind of things and say, that's medicine, that's not medicine, that's Christian, that's pagan. Something like Hippocrates is just clearly pre-Christian. Do people in the Middle Ages care about that? Not so much, actually. As far as they're concerned, Hippocrates is a great intellectual here, but there are lots of works travel under his name. But there's a famous discussion by Augustine, who knows lots of people think that Hippocrates is a very good writer. However, this means that lots of people circulate fraudulent work under his name. So there's even a proper sense of source criticism in 5th century North Africa, where they're aware that not everything that someone says is by Hippocrates or Galen is attached to that. But as far as he's concerned, this is valuable information that you should read. The only thing that Augustine says about non-Christian philosophy really is that Christian students shouldn't lose all of their time to studying non-Christian works. And he suggests that maybe people could make digests of useful information. And that's probably actually mostly what we have, digests of useful information. Okay, let's start thinking in this last little bit then about how some of these definitional issues play out and where we start to see where early medieval medicine might be going, at least in my head, on the back of this project. And in the first instance, thinking about the edges of medicine, and by which I mean just like, when is something medicine and when is it not? And what other kind of things are they? And in the first instance, I think it's very interesting. We have this image on the left. This is one of our Carrie's classic priests' handbooks, more or less. And it's a book really that has a lot of little material on astronomy, calendrical information, and some material on church canons. And it has a variety, but here in the middle, what you on the screen, it has some information about healthcare by months. So if it's cold and it's February, you probably need warmer food and drink, maybe a bath, nice warm bath, glass of wine afterwards. So it's a healthcare advice. There is information on when it is good to let blood. Bloodletting is a very important part of this healthcare environment. But what's particularly interesting about that, thinking about how the age of the moon might affect whether it is good day to let blood or not, you wouldn't necessarily say that was good science, but it is in a handbook in which they have lots of tables of how to calculate the age of the moon, how to predict the age of the moon in advance, because they need to be able to do that for the calculation of Easter, because you have to be able to observe Lent 40 days before you get to Easter. So you can't just look for the moon on the right day. So there's actually lots of suddenly healthcare starts to come in with a long series of interesting, yes, religious festival motivated computation, but still quite serious computation in which they have to master lunar cycles, solar cycles, their interaction, and then they're starting to apply where we are in time and space and in nature and how the body might fit into that. And that's kind of exciting. So something that you might start off going, oh, well, it's just a little bit of nonsense thinking about bloodletting, suddenly becomes part of a more interestingly crafted world of, yeah, use scientific thought. The historians of science get very, very angry, but it is a mathematically structured world in which, and do they necessarily believe it all? Again, it's impossible to know, but they are building these very complex compendia of notes and tables where they can compare notes on how things might be. And I think sometimes it's very easy to lose sight of the potential efficacy of the material. They're not saying that every recipe definitely works. They're saying a recipe might work. In this kind of context, in the image on the right, we have one of the things we found lots and lots and lots of spheres of life and death, in which you can do exciting sums, well, pretty basic sums, based on, again, what was the age of the moon on the day that you fell ill? What did you fall ill with? We'll do a little sum and come out. So if the number you kind of get at the top is in the top, then you're going to be okay. If it's in the bottom, you are not going to be okay. Very sinister. Like, this sounds much more superstition than it does proper medicine. And again, it's not clear that anybody really thought this was necessarily true, but it thought it might be at least interesting, and we'll make a note of it. These things often appear in spaces, so they are in that sense literally marginal to medical and other forms of knowledge. But people like to collect them. And so you often find libraries that have lots of different versions of these, so much so that this is a slide that I stole from Carrie van Rijn from a presentation she gave in Oslo earlier this year. This is showing what is notionally the same text or same kind of text with the question, what does each bloodletting lunary say is a good day to, green is a good day to give blood, yellow is neither good nor bad, red is a bad day. And so just across what she had here, 7 different texts, look how little agreement there is. And sometimes these can be found in related centers, sort of things circulating around with great contradiction. Sometimes you can find a couple of them in the same kind of manuscript, these kind of things. People are compiling potential information. These aren't all votes that one thing is definitely true, but they kind of monitor it. If they're spending a lot of time looking at the moon, looking at the sun, thinking about how astronomy works, it makes a lot of sense then to be thinking also, well, what does this say anything about healthcare? And I think sometimes it's useful for us to think about this as a collection of hypotheses rather than a collection of what people felt was true. This might loosen up some of the weirder things that come along with this kind of material. Now, already this kind of takes us into a world where we start to think about non-medical books and how some people, these kind of examples are not all things that are being billed as high medicine. These are things that people have encountered and thought were interesting or potentially helpful. I myself recently published an article a couple of weeks ago on the 8th century intellectual Bede, Bede's medical books. Bede didn't write any medical books that we know of, but we have a lot of his biblical commentaries. We have his commentaries on calendrical science, and we have more famously a big book of history of the English people and some hagiographical material. So what we can learn, though, by looking through Bede's work is that he did have medical books, and something that I was just particularly interested in is if you and Conan turned out was doing similar work in parallel, some similar results. Hooray! They all kind of all end up in similar kind of territory. And looking through the borrowings of medical texts that he was using the classic pseudo-Hippocratic letter to King Antiochus, which is mostly a kind of recommendation on healthcare through the year, mostly based on humors and taking different kind of ingredients. Although this text is itself so incredibly variable. I think there are 4 recognized published Latin editions of the text. They're all completely different. And there are at least another 3 or 4 just from the very earliest Latin manuscripts on top of that. And none of them can be shown to be a direct translation of the one Greek text that we have that's notionally from the 7th century, so around Bede's lifetime. So it's very exciting diversity of texts happens all over again. Now, for me, what was quite interesting then is that Bede has access to what's clearly either one weird hybrid text, or he has himself confected an interesting hybrid text of 2, possibly 3 versions of this material. But not so that he could make comments about health, but so that he can make comments about the structure of the calendar. Because what he's most interested in are how people set, I mean, he draws on similar material in 2 different parts. He wants to talk about when the seasons are, and he wants to talk about when equinoxes and the solstices are. And so he draws on medical information to prove this, because this starts to illuminate the coherence of natural laws. And he says right at the beginning of this book, and a phrase which actually imitates legal writing, that there are 3 kinds of law. There is divine law, there is natural law, and there is the kind of order that human beings artificially impose upon what they experience, which I think is actually quite interestingly perceptive for an 8th century monastic writer to be able to separate those things out. Basically saying, we can try and impose order on these things, but that doesn't mean that it's natural, and it doesn't mean that God set it in motion like that. This is just us as human beings trying to make sense of it. And so one of the things that he is turning to is medical information so that he can see if he can do that. He's doing this in my first example with calendar. In the second example, at the end of Acts of the Apostles, there's a reference to someone dying of dysentery. And in his first attempt to doing a commentary on the book of Acts of the Apostles, he doesn't have very much to say about this apart from attempts to heal him, show that it is always worth trying to heal a pagan. He does then a second stab, which is clearly he's got more books by this point and has some extra thoughts. And he, on the one hand, quotes a block from Cassius Felix's 5th century North African writer book on what dysenteric disease is, which is itself kind of interesting because he shows that he's got this kind of knowledge. And then to illuminate that, he quotes from a long passage from Gregory of Tours, a 6th century historian who writes an account of a dysenteric outbreak. Although Bede edits it to remove the bits from the historical account that don't fit with the theoretical account that he's just quoted. So he is using a medicine book to illuminate scripture and at the same time to correct the historical work of another writer. So none of this is necessarily medicine, but he's used this as knowledge. He's used this as wisdom. And so there's an interesting underlying question here is that Bede is approaching this underlying question. What did people think the challenges to address in early medieval medicine were? He doesn't really know what. You can help to understand nature, you can understand the natural world, and there's all sorts of exciting things that you can get out of this material. And it just helps us sometimes to think that for Bede, there is no real sense of how can I make progress in the field of medicine? But it's like, what can I use this information for? Where is it useful? What are the challenges that I face, in his case, as an intellectual, trying to make sense of the world? Now, this goes way beyond Bede in lots of senses. I'm coming down to my last few examples and reach a conclusion. These are two of our favorite examples from the Corpus project so far in similar kind of things. Where do we find people engaging with medicine away from medical contexts? On the left, we have a nice illustration of a medicinal herb found in the margins of Virgil's Aeneid, because this is part of a standard glossary on the Aeneid, which is, and somebody's like, oh, there's this reference to a herb here, and here's we're going to do the diagram, and it uses a kind of medical explanation, and it's got a couple of little recipes that you can use underneath. So someone is applying their medical knowledge to understand great works of literature. Very exciting. Our example on the right is in some respects even weirder. Yes, what is this creature doing in the middle? This is actually another book on astronomy, and it's part of a catalogue of the different star signs. And what you can't actually work out here is that the different scripts the first author left a lot of space around the illustrations. And so somebody in the monastery later on has gone in and used that to put in recipes, medical recipes. And so maybe this was just a very memorable place to put things. Where we don't want to lose this recipe. Where is it? It's by it's by Scorpio, it's by Cancer, it's by Gemini. And maybe this is a partial mnemonic, but there's an environment in which they needed space for writing, and that's what they found, and that's what they have used. So this is not, although Beccaria and Wickersheimer had been very interested in the kind of large medical projects, it's very interesting to see where people have just made little notes to selves, or indeed have just thought about how things could illustrate the other types of things. Just two more very quick examples that we have. Our most famous example, again, if you're in the room here, it's slightly behind something. A recipe for lizard shampoo, which we are counting because it has the same kind of structure and context as lots of medicine. For flowing hair, cover the whole head with fresh summer savory and salt and vinegar, then rub it with the ashes of burnt green lizard mixed with oil. It's not really medicine, but but actually we found lots of healthcare, little things like that are absolutely part of medicine, which is interesting. And then the second interesting thing is, where is this found? In the margins of a calendar. I don't know if the monk is being particularly upset with his tonsure and just going to think about how, if I did have long hair, how this would be nice. My last example here is a recipe against hemorrhoids using cinnamon, again, because everyone loves cinnamon. Something Riopansia, we're a bit unsure of, myrrh, mugwort, new peppergrain, and put it all in a full cup. Recipe against hemorrhoids. This is found at the very end of a long thing on calendrical calculations. And in fact, so that's just the first few lines. What it then follows is an account of a specific kind of fake calculation, mathematical calculation you have to do to the lunar cycle to make it track with the solar cycle. We'd always like to imagine this person was so bored writing out all the stuff about how to do this kind of stuff. And then I'm feeling very uncomfortable and I need something to make me feel a bit better. So this is kind of coming right down to the end. So we often find these things in another picture of a big book. This is my favorite one from the early 8th century, where we find all these things mixed together. And very much what we are hoping to do is start to think about medicine as part of general knowledge rather than a very specialist discipline that people just didn't get. There are no scholars of medicine in the period we're looking at before the Salerno School. This is very much people trying to, in a non-specialized way, take specialized resources and see what they can do with them and collect them. And while that is, again, disappointing from the perspective of great medicine, it's kind of interesting. They have imperfect knowledge resources. They know that these are imperfect knowledge resources. This is why they're so fluid, and they're just trying to adapt them. And that's super interesting, we think. Okay, so just very quickly then to finish up, where next then on this basis for early medieval medicine? Well, we have all sorts of plans and ideas. Our hand list, our 200 manuscripts, is going to grow into a full new catalogue. So be nice and coherent with lots of cross references. So you can. So we have a proper sense of what the evidence for early medieval medicine is. Having half an idea of what the evidence is, and some guesswork makes things really. That's why like Conan's work and Claire Burridge's work, Meg Lair's work, starting to pull these things together has been really incredibly valuable. And we're clearly at the beginning of a new golden age of understanding early medieval medicine. To assist with that, though, we don't just need lists. We're doing new critical editions and translations. Meg, Jeff, and I have been meeting every Thursday to. We're doing an edition of a medical letter book at the moment. Karine, Claire, and Tim Hertog have been doing a collection of medical recipes, and so we're just trying to produce a series of new editions of text so that people can get better access to them. The translation is very important as well because a lot of this stuff is very technical and required. We can't just say manuscripts are now digitized, go read them, because a lot of them will people find very hard. So the five of us are co-authoring a new introduction to early medieval medicine, which we will hope will actually a nice new guide to the subject. The last book, called Early Medieval Medicine, by the way, in English, came out in 1937. So it's a little by Lauren McKinney. It's probably about time for a bit of an update. McKinney's book is very good, but I mean, lots of things that he says, interpretations of manuscripts, interpretations of various things are just now out of date. I need a bit of a new introduction for a new time. And then partly what's brought me here today, looking at new intersections with osteoarchaeology and other field-crossing disciplines to understand theory of practice of medieval health cultures in bodies and in manuscripts. There's been a lot of great work, again, Monica Green and other people using aDNA to new histories of plague. My colleague Alison Beach at St Andrews has been doing great work on disability, analysing skeletons. The new techniques are opening new doors as well. So alongside this like classical philological interpretation of what medicine is out there, it'd be great to not just complete this as a project, but look for opportunities to see what other information we can get out of looking at the manuscripts, looking at the different contexts in which medicine was studied, and try to open up more about what healthcare culture looked like in what would hitherto been thought of as a particularly dark age, but which we can now see to be a much more engaged and interested age than we had done before. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, James, for this very interesting lecture. And